Namaskar. Welcome to another episode of Opinionated. Today, we are going to discuss the favorite topic of Western media, which is democratic backsliding of India, right? And these are typically written all by Indian journalists working for Western publications and news media. And they often write about how India is like become a dictatorship. It's no longer a democracy. Um, so we're going to examine their top allegations against India, right? And we're going to compare that with what happens in the West, especially in North America, right? So the first thing we hear, you know, in the media that look, there's a lot of police excesses in India, right? Last couple of years back when there was a farmers' protest in India, and in every news media I read in the Western news media that the police were doing excesses. They were using water cannons. They were not letting people having have a voice in India. So I wanted to compare that. Is that really true that in India people don't have a voice, and is it true that in Western world people have a voice? Now the recent Palestine protest has given us a lot of data to show which country people really have a voice. Now look at what's happening in the colleges. Uh, while I don't agree with the the view, a lot of views of these college students, but they have a right to protest, right? That's their freedom of speech that is given by the Constitution of the United States. That somebody can protest non-violently without any fear of repercussions. But look at what's happening in these college campuses. The police are being called. They are violently cracking down against the protesters. They are arresting professors. Colleges are debarring students. In some states, by law, these protests are getting blocked. Like governors and the legislators are passing laws that blocks these protests, right? Stops these protests. Compare also, what happened in Canada a couple of years back, right? The Canadian truckers protest. The truckers were protesting against what's happening in in the Canadian ecosystem during COVID, and the police went and violently cracked down on them. They were jailed. They were forcibly removed. And contrast that with India. In India, the farmers' protest lasted for months. I think probably close to 2.5 months. They defied, and it was during COVID. Remember, I mean, there was a COVID lockdown order. The second wave in India hit. A lot of people were dying. The government issued a lockdown order. The farmers did not listen and adhere to the lockdown order. They were tolerated for months until it became intolerable because of the spread of the virus, and the police used water cannons and tear gas to disperse the protesters. Remember, they were blocking the main highway. They were blocking the highway that is used to transfer goods and services, and they were let to continue the protest for months, right? I mean, students were not removed from colleges. Nothing happened to them. They were Police came, they took them in their police vans and took them away and sent them back home. So now compare who doesn't have a voice. Does Indian citizens living in India doesn't have a voice, or the US students who are protesting against, you know, some sort of a genocide that's been committed in Gaza, do they not have a voice? The other, if you remember a couple of months back, 6 months back approximately, when this Rahul Gandhi defamation case was going on, These Indian journalists writing for Western media started commenting that, oh, India is cracking down on the opposition, right? Rahul Gandhi was the opposition leader, rightly. And what happened was a couple of years back, he made uncharitable comment about all the people who had the surname Modi, right? He said, like, what's common with all the Modis, like Nirav Modi and Narendra Modi, and his allegation was all Modis are corrupt, right? So there is one gentleman in Gujarat who felt offended and put a defamation case against Rahul Gandhi, and the local court uh, essentially agreed on the defamation case and said, no, Rahul Gandhi is liable for contempt and he should be jailed. He wasn't jailed because he got bail and he was only debarred from the parliament. Even that got stayed by the Supreme Court and he went back to being a member of parliament. While I don't agree that just because you made an incendiary comment against a particular group of people, you should face a jail term. I don't think that's the right way to deal in democracy. But let's compare with what's happening in the United States. The prime opposition leader, which is Donald Trump, who is also the contender for president in this year's election against Biden. Look at the civil lawsuit in which he lost by the New York Attorney General, right? So they brought a lawsuit which was so weird in nature. And the entire premise of the lawsuit was that he inflated his assets in trying to get a loan from, I think, um Deutsche Bank, if I'm not, if my memory serves me right. Now, every businessman tries to make sure that their assets are valued at the absolute maximum possible value. The reason is they want to get the best loan, the best terms. So if he is, you know, prosecuted against that, then every single businessman should be prosecuted. And why wasn't he prosecuted for such a long time in New York? I mean, he's doing business in New York since many decades. Why just before the election? The judge was a liberal judge. And remember, liberal judge. This is the only country in the world where you have liberal, conservative judges, right? So you had a liberal judge, a Democratic Attorney General, trying to prosecute Donald Trump right before elections, and hold him liable for inflating his assets and putting a bail bond amount of in hundreds of millions of dollars, trying to restrict his ability to go and fight the election. And now, then again, you have the hush money case, which is again trying to make sure he doesn't have any money or space or time available to fight the election. You're you're actively suppressing the prime opposition in the United States, and the so-called journalists. I don't see a single news article about this. Now, if this is not democratic backsliding, then what it is? This is nothing but a democratic backsliding of the United States. Pure and simple. But the Western media, they won't talk about the United States. The United States is always at the highest pedestal, where India is now worse than Afghanistan or Pakistan, right? Um, Similarly, we also hear the third allegation is the Indian government clamps down on social media companies and restricts free speech. Again, I don't think you should clamp down on social media or any form of media unless the speech calls for violence, the speech calls for secessionism, the speech calls for terrorism, the speech um, calls for defamation against a particular group or community of people, right? So I don't agree that what Indian government might have done, that should not have been done. But let's look at what's happening in the United States. Now we got this Facebook files. I think it was by some Republican congressman who disclosed all these data. Jim Jordan, perhaps, I don't remember. Um, and what we found out that was during COVID, the government of the United States, the federal government, the Biden administration, was forcing the social media companies to delete and remove any mention of COVID being a lab leak, right? For reasons unknown, uh, they wouldn't strictly let any such information leak and being let that being leaked in the media or the public, and they would clamp it down. Now we know that there is a high likelihood that this was a lab leak. This was not, what is claimed in the wet market. And the US agencies have told this now. But the US government was actively suppressing it. Why? No, nobody knows. I mean, perhaps Fauci and others were complicit in this. But again, comparing the allegations, United States is known to actively suppress, monitor, and nudge the social media companies to shape the social media information and posts in a manner of their choosing. But again, those journals, Indian origin journals, would never ever write this. And there would be no mention that there is a freedom of speech clampdown and democratic backsliding of United States. Now let's look at human rights in general, right? We hear a lot about from these Indian origin journals that there's a lot of human rights violations in India. Maybe, maybe not. But let's look at what is the human rights of violations in the United States. While the whole world is progressing on abortion rights and reproductive rights of women, the United States is the only country who's regressing on the reproductive rights of women. Now, I am not a supporter of late term abortion because I believe that when a child is more than, let's say, 30 months, 35 months old, 36, 30, I beg your pardon, 30, 35 weeks old, the child can feel pain, right? And I don't think late stage abortion should be allowed because uh, it is similar to, let's say, terminating a child who's already born, right? But in United States, there are a lot of these states who are blocking any sorts of abortion. Like there are states who are doing 6-week abortion limits, no exception for rape or incest. Now, you know, how many women would know that they are pregnant in 6 weeks? And even if they know that they are pregnant in 6 weeks, how will they find a doctor and work towards getting an abortion? And not providing any exception for rape and incest. Imagine how much trauma this woman has to go through. Because if this woman is raped, now this woman has to carry this child of the rapist for the full term. I mean, look at the regression of human rights of women in the United States. And look at what's happening in India. The reproductive rights of women is actually being making people are making it more progressive, more liberal. Women have access to reproductive abortions up to 24 weeks. So it means they have enough. Of course, there's complete exception for rape or incest, and exceptions have been made for severe, health problems for women and the child, even after 24 weeks. And within this 24 weeks, a woman has enough time to understand whether they want to keep the child, and they would go through all the scans and all the checks to determine if they want to keep the child or not. And we talk about, and these journals talk about the human rights violations in India and would never talk about the human rights violations in the United States. If United States is not backsliding in the democratic scale, then who is? I mean, on the similar lines, look at the maternity and paternity rights in the United States and India. Post reproductive rights, women in India has up to 26 weeks of paid maternity leave, and that their jobs are protected to ensure that the child in the first 6 months get adequate care from the mother. Despite India having more support system, right? Because in India, families are very close, they live in joint families. Men have access to 15 days of paid paternity leave by law. In the United States, women don't have any post reproductive rights at all. If, you know, if a lot of women, they give birth and they have to go back to working because there is no support system. Nobody, there are a lot of single mothers who, if they don't go back to work, would have no money to feed herself and her child. Now, these journalists have the audacity of talking about human rights abuse in India, but I find no mention about human rights abuse in United States, especially for women. Let's also look at the hot topic, transgender rights. Now, of course, in the United States, there is excesses on both sides. On one side, we have absolute lack of recognition on transgender rights, right? Um, in terms of the law. On the other side, we also have excesses of gender fluidity, where today you're a transgender, tomorrow you're a man, day after tomorrow you're a woman, on the next week you're a cow. I mean, you are whatever you are whenever you wake up and you decide to be what you want to be, right? So that craziness also exists. And I don't favor that sort of fringe crazy mentality, because it actually reduces the focus on true transgender rights. So there are people who are transgenders, generally transgender. They are not gender fluid, they are transgender, and they have no rights in the United States. India is one of the few countries which recognizes transgender as a sex. And we talk about democratic backsliding about India and not United States. Which country is truly more progressive? Is it India or United States? Or Canada? I wonder, and these Indian journals would never talk about that. And the last thing I want to talk about is disenfranchisement of voters, right? Now, I don't know if you've heard about the redistricting or gerrymandering concept in the United States. So what happens is every, few years, I think it's 4 or 5 years or so, the each state government in the United States would look at their population and create new districts or redistrict them uh, to ensure that the people in that district can elect their leaders for the US House of Representatives. Now, the original idea is because, look, Every 5, 10 years, people move, there's migration that happens. People staying in one place may not be staying in that place, or that area might have a different demography. So there should be a good representation, right? A fair representation. But what happens here, and I'll show you some pictures, the state legislatures design the district in a way, whoever is in the majority, and both Democrats and Republicans do the gerrymandering in a way that it looks this weird, wonky district, which really requires deep imagination. And what they do is they put everybody, who would vote for the opposition in that district, and everybody else in other districts. So there would be one or two seats in a state which would vote 90% for the opposition party, and every other district would have like 60-70% vote, or 50 more than 50% vote for the main party, the party in power. So when the elections happen in November for US Congress, from that state they would primarily elect members who belong to the ruling party of that state. If this is not voter disenfranchisement, then what it is? Does this happen in India? Is there voter disenfranchisement in India? No, not a single case. In fact, the election officials will climb mountains, bridges, cross lakes, canal, seas to ensure every voter gets a say. And yet, our favorite anti-India journals would never ever talk about voter disenfranchisement in United States. If this is not democratic backsliding, then what is it? So, my friends, again, I always harp on it that to counter a negative voice, we have to have a positive voice. I want to bring the positive voice, the truth, in front of everybody so that people are aware. I am not saying that we should not criticize or comment on what Indian government may or may not be doing, but we should be fair. If something is happening in India that is not correct, we should absolutely comment about it. But if something is happening in Western countries which is not fair and correct, we should be commenting about it too. Namaste and Jai Hind.